Hello there, it's Luke, and in this tutorial we're going to be discussing the formation of tissue fluid, and we're going to be looking at that in health, so in sort of normal physiology, and we're going to be considering things like Starling's forces, and we're also going to consider some examples of pathophysiology where you might develop some edema or possibly even pulmonary edema within the lungs. So we're just going to move on to the next slide. So I'm going to introduce you to another sort of oversimplified diagram. So you'll see through the middle we've got a blood vessel, and within there we've got the intravascular space, and either side of that we've got some interstitial space. So that's the space between the blood vessels and the cells. Okay, so this is all extracellular fluid compartments. And we'll recall that fluid will flow down a pressure gradient, so it will move from an area of high pressure to an area of lower pressure. And if we were to think about our capillaries, so our smallest blood vessels within the tissues, their pressure is highest on the arterial side, and so it will move through the capillary bed if the pressure is lower on the venous side, and that's what generally happens in health. Now, you'll recall that your capillaries are permeable to water and other small molecules or the other solutes, and so these will sort of may have tendency to flow out into the interstitial space, and we're going to discuss how that occurs. So, just to recap, as we've said, that fluid will flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, and within this semi-permeable membrane, so the capillary walls are permeable to water and other small solutes, then where there is high pressure at the arterial end of a capillary, then that will sort of force fluid into the interstitial space, which has a lower pressure. And we call this force that's exerted by the fluid pressure hydrostatic pressure. Okay, and you'll probably notice from the arrows as they sort of diminish in this diagram that hydrostatic pressure gets lessens the further along the capillary you go from the arterial side, where the pressure is greater, to the venous side where the pressure is much less, and so you've got less hydrostatic pressure forcing fluid into the interstitial space. Now, within the capillaries, within the blood vessels and the capillaries, we have larger molecules, things like proteins and blood cells and this sort of thing, that cannot pass through the sort of gaps within the sort of capillaries, and that's why we say that our capillary bed is semi-permeable, because it will let through smaller molecules, but not these bigger molecules. There's proteins and albumin and red blood cells, that sort of thing. And because of this, the proteins and these big molecules exert a pressure on the fluid within the interstitial space to draw that fluid back into the intravascular space. So there'll be a sort of pretty constant pull of fluid and the sort of smaller solutes back from the interstitial space and into the capillaries as you get towards the venous end. Now, this can variably be referred to as oncotic pressure or colloid osmotic pressure. And again, like it says here, because the sort of protein or large molecule content of the blood doesn't really change along the length of the capillary in health, then that oncotic pressure is fairly constant. So these two pressures act on the fluid at the same time. So there's the hydrostatic pressure sort of forcing the fluid out of the capillary into the interstitial space, and the oncotic pressure drawing the fluid back in. And almost all of the water that is pushed out by the hydrostatic pressure is drawn back into the capillary by the time it gets to the venous end. it's not quite fully sort of reabsorbed, and there's often a sort of greater amount of fluid that's been pushed into the interstitium than is recovered into the capillary bed, and we call this net increase in fluid in the interstitial space net filtration. However, I don't know if you can see at the bottom of the diagram there, we have another capillary network that runs alongside the sort of blood systemic capillary network called the lymphatic system, lymphatic capillaries, and they will draw in fluid and sort of drain that back eventually into the sort of blood circulation, if you like. Now, this combination of forces that are moving the fluid between these two different compartments, between the intravascular space and the interstitial space, are referred to as Starling forces. So that's the combination of hydrostatic pressure and oncotic pressure. So we're going to consider some examples of things that might occur in sort of illness or pathology or various sort of states other than somebody who's completely healthy. So say we have fewer proteins, fewer large molecules within the blood vessels. What if we consider what might happen to the different forces acting, the different Starling forces acting? We might see that there's a reduction in oncotic pressure because there's fewer of those large molecules drawing the water back in. However, hydrostatic pressure may be completely unchanged, and so you get this net movement of fluid from the intravascular space into the interstitial space. And this presents clinically as edema. And here's some pretty severe pitting edema. You can see that the person placing a finger and pressing down, it can be quite uncomfortable, and it's leaving a mark on this person's leg as they take that finger away. And such is the magnitude of the edema within the tissues. So what if we consider that we have a patient who is profoundly dehydrated? Maybe it could be somebody with a diabetic ketoacidosis, or it could be somebody who's not managed to be able to eat and drink for days, or maybe they've had diarrhea. How might this affect the sort of Starling forces within the capillaries? Well, we'll likely see a reduction in hydrostatic pressure, okay, and there's no change in the oncotic pressure because the proteins haven't gone anywhere, and so you don't have that same movement of fluid out of the capillary and into the interstitial space. And again, we might see this if we were examining a patient as a reduction in skin turgor. So you could sort of pinch the skin, and whereas on me, if I have to pinch the skin, I'm fairly well hydrated, that just disappears, that sort of pinched piece of skin. In this diagram, we can see that in this dehydrated patient, the sort of skin fold remains exactly where it is. Now, we mentioned earlier on that as we move from the arterial side to the venous side of the capillary bed, there's a drop-off in pressure. But what happens if there's a build-up in pressure on the venous side? We can see that the hydrostatic pressure doesn't diminish as much as you travel from the arterial to the venous side in this situation. So you've got this higher than normal pressure on the venous side, and you're going to get a greater volume of fluid leaving the intravascular space and entering the interstitial space. You still have the oncotic pressure trying to draw it back in, but it's overwhelmed by the sort of the extra pressure that exists throughout the capillary bed. And again, this increased sort of net filtration will present as edema. Now, if that is because you have say, an issue with the right side of your heart. It's not pumping effectively, not shifting the blood from the systemic circulation through the lungs effectively. That might present as sort of generalised edema, similar to what we just saw in the previous picture with those edematous legs. However, it can occur locally. So you can imagine a situation whereby there is a deep vein thrombosis in one of the great veins of a person's leg, and so that blockage leads to an elevation in pressure on the venous side, and so this hydrostatic pressure is elevated, and there's a greater net movement of fluid into the tissues that isn't then sort of draining back. We're going to move from the systemic circulation to the pulmonary circulation now. So we're thinking about the blood coming back in through the vena cava into the right side of the heart and being pumped through the pulmonary artery, through the lungs, and into the left side of the heart. Now, ordinarily in health, this is a much lower pressure circulation. You don't need the sort of great pressures that are generated by the left ventricle, for instance. And in health, in our diagram here, we can see that the smaller amount of hydrostatic pressure roughly equals the oncotic pressure within the capillaries, and so there's not really that same net filtration of fluid. In general, your lungs in health shouldn't have a lot of interstitial fluid being sort of pushed out by the hydrostatic pressure. However, if you have a situation whereby the left side of the heart is failing, and here's an echocardiogram image of a failing heart, so I don't know if you can see my cursor there. This is the left ventricle, it's not beating very well. You get a sort of backlog, if you like, a back pressure of fluid coming back through the left side of the heart and into the lungs, and I've relabeled this diagram with some elevated pressures in sort of the left ventricular diastolic pressure, and also that's transmitted through into the left atrium, which back through the pulmonary veins and back into the pulmonary arterial pressure. So that whole capillary bed through the pulmonary circulation has an elevated hydrostatic pressure, and you can probably anticipate that in this situation there's going to be a net movement of fluid from within the blood vessels, so within the capillaries, within the sort of pulmonary circulation, because of that, because the hydrostatic pressure never really sort of diminishes along the length of that capillary bed, because there's sort of obstruction of the failing LV at the venous end. You get that net movement of fluid into the pulmonary tissues, and this, of course, would lead to what we know as pulmonary edema. So you probably have this breathless, hypoxic patient. This is an X-ray showing sort of diffuse, fluffy, dependent changes all the way through here. This person might be very hypoxic and breathless, as I say, and that's the consequence of a failing heart on those Starling forces. So, in summary, we've introduced the idea of hydrostatic and oncotic pressures, which are collectively known as the Starling forces, and discussed how they're responsible for the movement of fluid between those two extracellular fluid compartments. We have considered some pathological processes which lead to edema, or at the other end of things, dehydrated tissues, and then we've paid particular focus to pulmonary edema as it would occur in the context of a failing left ventricle. Thank you very much for your time.